Hi everyone, it's me Joyce, and I'm back with a different type of video today because I want to discuss a staple and huge part of the teen/slash romance movies that I've consumed growing up, the All-American Cheerleader. As we slowly begin to dissect the media that we've watched growing up and analyze it with a completely different lens, I began thinking about how prominent it was for cheerleaders to be in teen movies and shows, and how it's not really a thing anymore. And also, I've been forced to read so many Jennifer's Body tweets in the past 6 months, so I also blame Twitter. When thinking about movies that I loved growing up, like A Cinderella Story, the Bring It On franchise, Love Don't Cost a Thing, and many more, you kind of see that the cheerleader was a staple in a lot of these movies. And with the golden age of rom-coms, she was more popular than ever. Whether you thought she was amazing and wanted to be her, or you thought she was terrible and a huge bully, she was everywhere. Until she wasn't. So what happened to the All-American Cheerleader, and what kind of impact did she have on pop culture? Let's find out. So the history of cheerleading is a pretty long one. It originally got its start in the UK but showed up in the US in the 1880s, and the sport has a lot of ties with American football. By the 1880s, Princeton had an all-male pep club, and despite it being a very female-dominated field now, the first cheerleaders were actually men, since a lot of colleges only admitted men at the time. And a lot of firsts and inventions we associate with cheerleading, like chants, herkies, and vinyl pom-poms, were all made by men. And many famous men were cheerleaders in their university days, such as Presidents Dwight Eisenhower and George W. Bush, and even actors such as Steve Martin and Samuel L. Jackson. It wasn't until 1923 where women were allowed to actually cheer for the first time at the University of Minnesota, and there was definitely pushback. A lot of people considered the sport too masculine for women, which is definitely ironic. The 20s also saw tumbling and acrobatics first being added to routines. But it wasn't until the 40s when women joined cheerleading in large numbers, since a lot of college-age men went off to fight in the war. And this pretty much changed the nature of the sport. When more women started joining the sport, there was definitely this shift where beauty was more emphasized than the athleticism of the sport. Essentially, the women were more well received because they were physically attractive, and anytime you went to a sporting event, there was a chance you'd see beautiful girls. This eventually led to the transformation of the sport from being too masculine to an entirely female endeavor. High schools started recruiting more women and eventually led to only asking women to audition, thus cementing the sport as one that is dominated by women to this day. This also had the side effect of creating this image and stereotype for women who did cheerleading. In an article published by The Atlantic titled "How Cheerleading Went from Male to Female," it recounts how the stereotypical image of cheerleading became of women on the sidelines supporting their guys. It also talks about how in the mid-20th century, the image of a cheerleader wasn't of a boisterous campus leader like it was when men were the face of it, but of someone with manners, dependability, as well as good personal appearance. And I think this is definitely different from how cheerleaders are depicted in the media in the past 30 years or so. Back then, the cheerleader was definitely more on the sidelines and expected to uphold these values, such as respectabilities, and she was quote-unquote good. I'd like to include an example of one of the most famous cheerleaders in pop culture, Sandy Olsen, from the hit 1978 movie musical Grease. In the movie, Sandy is a transfer student at Rydell High that had a summer fling with resident bad boy Danny Zuko back in Australia, only to find him in her new school in America. And there's shenanigans and singing and teenage angst, and it's overall a really fun movie. In a mostly negative review by Charles Champlin of the Los Angeles Times, he did say that it is the 1950s, maybe the last innocent decade allowed to us, played back through a grotesquely distorting 70s consciousness, which I think is a little harsh, but an interesting statement altogether. While there is definitely this weird ideology in pop culture as the 50s being such an innocent and traditional decade, especially considering what happens in the decades before and after it. I think it did help with this perception of the cheerleader at this moment in time. I feel as if before modern films started including the cheerleader in various different movies, she was kind of treated like the 1950s in a way. She was innocent, studious, responsible, and I also feel like Sandy is the perfect example of this. She is the poster child of this angel archetype that was afforded to cheerleaders before they became completely demonized in the media. And while there can be nice cheerleaders, like Brittany from Glee, I feel like for the most part, cheerleaders aren't usually depicted like that. And if they are nice, it causes conflict within the group, as if you can't be both at the same time for whatever reason. And that really just leads us to all the cheerleaders that occupy the other category. So if you've ever watched any rom-com or horror film with a teen cast, you're probably familiar with the more modern depictions of cheerleaders. So by analyzing movies and TV shows that have depicted cheerleaders in the past 30 years or so, we can see a pattern starting to emerge. Out of the many characters that take up space in a high school setting, like the jock, the nerd, and the new girl who isn't like other girls, the cheerleader is always portrayed in a particularly harsh light. If they're not super bitchy, they're just plain mean or evil with little to no explanation other than jealousy, or that's just the way she is. They're consistently portrayed as not very smart, especially if they're the sidekicks of the alpha cheerleader. She's also needlessly sexualized to the point of annoyance because, these are teenage girls that they are depicting. And that's really the crux of the problem. These depictions of the cheerleader constantly make her out to be shallow and superficial and super one-dimensional. And honestly, Hollywood does that consistently with pretty much everyone, but I would say that it's particularly bad when it comes to teenage girls. And we can trace the roots of this new hypersexualized cheerleader to the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders back in the early 70s. For the 1970 season, the cheerleaders, formerly known as the Cowbells and Bows, decided to revamp their image in order to drum up more interest and boost attendance. This resulted in a new all-female team recruited from local high schools, a change in uniform, and routines that were more dance-like and less acrobatic. It wasn't until the 1972 season where they had an all-adult team that was selected primarily for their looks, and the uniforms were designed to be more revealing, switching from the traditional skirt to hot pants, which were very popular in the 70s. This in turn inspired movies like The Cheerleaders, Swinging Cheerleaders, and The Pom Pom Girls, which also took part in the sexualization of the characters in the movies. And I think the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders did play a part in influencing the image of cheerleaders on the big screen, and in turn helped change the image of cheerleaders forever. It did create this trickle-down effect that infiltrated colleges and high schools, albeit at a slower pace. But I also do believe that fashion trends and the changing of times also helped, because hot pants were very popular in the 70s and shorter length everything started becoming more popular as well. But I think the way the public view of cheerleaders changed during this time is extremely interesting, because when we go back to Sandy, part of the reason why she's so innocent and why she stands out from the rest of the pink ladies is because she's a cheerleader. The only other cheerleader whose name we know, Patty Simcox, is referred to as a goody two-shoes and pretty much a nerd. Then we fast forward a couple of decades and the opposite is true. Part of the reason why a character is evil or terrible is because she's a cheerleader. The cheerleader is often used as a way to depict the social hierarchy of the school, a way to show popularity through their ruthlessness, promiscuity, vapidity, and overall just how pretty they are. So if it was the perfect way to show all of these things in a typical rom-com, then where did they go? What happened to all the cheerleading movies? Bring It On really is one of my absolute favorite teen movies of all time. As someone who grew up with older sisters, I really was forced to watch any Bring It On movie whenever it came on screen. And while there are some amazing moments in the other movies, I do believe the first one is in a league of its own. Not only is it one of the best movies that I've ever seen that actually touches on cultural appropriation It also subverts the genre in a way that was different from others. In the movie, they actually treat the cheerleaders like actual characters and give them motivations and goals and real flaws and insecurities that make them relatable and not a stock character just spitting out lines. Because we're seeing the film through newcomer Missy's eyes, she gives us an inside look at the typical Toro cheerleader. At the beginning of the movie, even Missy herself doesn't think too much of cheerleaders, saying that the only reason she even joined the team in the first place is because the school didn't have a gymnastics one. An article by HuffPost about the death of the cheerleader says it's Missy's arc that disrupts the idea of who these girls are as she enters their world. The Toros are not the superficial brats she presumes them to be. They are true athletes, and more important than that, real people she learns to respect. The movie really did subvert the genre and provide some context to the preconceived notions we had about cheerleaders that goes almost completely out the window when they made a billion sequels. And I think this marks the decline in movies that included cheerleading as the subject matter. During the next decade, we would see movies like the Bring It On sequels, Fired Up, and Jennifer's Body, and even TV shows like Glee that featured them, but it was pretty much the end of an era. I think the decline in rom-coms also coincides with the decline for cheerleading movies as well. I think that there's been less of a focus on big blockbuster films that are made for women or with women in mind in the past couple of years. Say what you want about the genre, but it was a pretty big way to showcase stories that consistently featured female main characters and were centered around women as well. There's a reason why people still talk about rom-coms and teen movies that were made damn near 30 years ago so much, because we don't get nearly the same amount of original movies that are female-centric like we did back then. And that's a whole nother video, but because of this decline, it also makes sense that the cheerleader archetype would decline as well. I also think that attitudes changed in this time. While the early 2000s was very hyper-feminine and girly in retrospect, I think it's also to remember that these things weren't always viewed as neutrally or positively like it is now. Back then, femininity was highly demonized, and being the tomboy or not like other girls was very in, with songs like Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne and Stupid Girls by Pink, and movies that constantly reinforce this idea. We moved away from the typical formulas for high school movies. I think it's interesting how even though cheerleading is a sport, one that requires practice and tournaments and a competition, that it doesn't really get treated like other sports movies. They're pigeonholed into being chick flicks. And I do think it's kind of fitting that she's on her way out, because I don't think Hollywood even knew what to do with her anyways. I think the article says it perfectly when they mention that after the commercialization of the sport, she was co-opted by film and TV into a symbol of the most negative feminized traits, a prepackaged set of all our worst ideas about teenage girls. I think eventually people figured out that demonizing a certain group of teenage girls for just existing was probably not the serve they thought it was. So where is the All-American Cheerleader? Where she'll always remain, in our hearts. No, that was super corny, but she will, and with our society's current obsession with rehashing the past, it's probably only a matter of time before she gets a revival someday down the line.